Welcome to IHA. Excuse me. Welcome to our webinar. This is Health Literacy and Spirituality at the End of Life. We welcome our speakers, Russell Bennett and Dr. Francisco Fernandez. We will get started in just a minute. We're letting everybody come in. So I just want to welcome everyone, and we will be getting started in just a moment. Welcome, everyone. I think most people are probably here. We will get started. Welcome. I'm Julie McKinney, and I'm going to be moderating today. This is IHA's webinar on health literacy and spirituality at the end of life. And we're really excited to have Dr. Francisco Fernandez and Russell Bennett talking to us about this. And just quickly, you know, you're all muted. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Please feel free to put any comments in the chat. We may, if we don't have time for questions, then we will record them and send answers later on, because there's a lot we'll be covering. So if you have technical difficulties, there's an email on the slide there that you can get support at. And this will be recorded and posted on the webinar page of the Solutions Center. If you need CE credits, you'll get an email at the end of this. And once you fill out the evaluation and submit it, then your credits will be emailed to you. So I think that's it. Just wanted to get that through that quickly. And I just want to quickly introduce Russell Bennett. He is an IHA consultant and a U.S. native who's lived in Mexico for 30 years. He's bicultural and bilingual in English and Spanish, and has expertise in health literacy, social determinants of health, patient engagement, vaccine confidence, and strategy marketing. So he will speak first, and welcome to both of you. We're excited to hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Julie, and good morning, Francisco. Good morning, IHA team. The past 2 or 3 years have made many of us more aware of death and end-of-life issues than we might have been in the past. My own family has been touched very personally by the death of my father this year and the death of several other close relatives and friends. The pandemic disrupted historical mortality patterns and caused the largest jump in deaths in 100 years, according to the US Census Bureau. Worldwide, there have been similar trends. While some deaths, perhaps about 10 to 20%, are sudden and unexpected, and tragically do not give family and friends time to say goodbye to the person, most deaths, statistically, happen after a short or longer end-of-life process, where family, caregivers, and providers have the opportunity to interact with the dying loved one for at least some time. According to the British National Health Service, end-of-life care should begin when you need it and may last a few days or months, or sometimes more than a year. People in lots of different situations can benefit from end-of-life care. Some of them may be expected to die within the next few hours or days. Others receive end-of-life care over many months. Our focus today is on those deaths that are anticipated, that allow some time in the end-of-life process, and how that process can be improved through the recognition of health literacy and spirituality, whatever that means to the dying person and their loved ones and caregivers. Today, we'll focus on several things. Mainly, we'd like to operationalize the ability of people at the end of life to voice what has given them a sense of meaning during their life, to take full advantage of end-of-life care through increasing health literacy beyond the medical aspects. So Dr. Fernandez will talk about health literacy, about spirituality, with the goal of increasing understanding about spirituality. And he'll talk about health literacy, about the end-of-life process, about psychosocial issues for patients, caregivers, and family, which are complicated but addressing them will improve outcomes and reinforce patient autonomy at the end of life. The goals of health literacy at the end of life are to help people think about, what's my legacy going to be? When a person begins to deal with the loss of their sense of self, how do you rehabilitate that sense of self and achieve a sense of balance between their best life and the end, which happens at this moment? And how a person experiences their helplessness and despair, and how you as a caregiver or provider and they face their needs, is key for maintaining positive goals and morale until the end. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Francisco Fernandez, the founding dean and emeritus professor of the Department of Psychiatry of the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley School of Medicine. And he comes to us today from Harlingen, Texas, where he lives. He'll talk about the palliation of psychiatric, psychosocial, and spiritual suffering at the end of life, the role of health literacy. So Dr. Fernandez, now that I've introduced you, I'd like to let you say a few more things about your wonderful and long history and any disclosures, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Russ, and thank you, IHA, for giving me this opportunity to be with you today. Russ mentioned that, we've all been through this in some form or another in recent past. And it's so much so that I am in that situation presently. So I apologize for any mishaps that occur, largely because I'm not where I was going to give this talk. I'm at the medical school with the benefit of having Russ advancing the slides for me, but you're going to hear a terrible word next every time that you hear me having him change the slides. So what you see on this slide is that my experience has been in a variety of different institutions and places where I served in different capacities. And my experience with end-of-life care has been influenced by my training as a psychiatrist, but also from professional experiences through my work, largely in what's called consultation liaison psychiatry, which is the psychiatry of the medically and surgically ill, which led me to, during the time that I was both at MD Anderson Hospital in the HIV clinic, as well as at St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital and Texas Heart Institute, dealing with end-stage disease. It was there that I became the chair of the ethics committee at St. Luke's Episcopal Hospital and transitioned to work at Loyola University in Chicago, where I was influenced by the work that was going on in the Cardinal Bernardin Center of Dying with Dignity. Later on is in Tampa, where I hope everyone is safe today, and my family from the University of South Florida there. We connected with the Samaritan Institute that was the Gulf Coast chapter from the Institute in Denver, and created a fellowship training, post-psychiatric training, on the counseling that occurs at the end of life. And then later here, I came to Texas to be the founding dean of a medical school on the border by Brownsville and Edinburgh and McAllen. And here we created a course called Medicine, Behavior, and Society, which was part of which was to create the didactic curriculum as well as the clinical experiences of working with people that were at the end of life. Please note that I have no financial disclosures to share with you, and as part of palliation, I am not going to discuss any kind of medical interventions in this presentation. Next. Next. Oh, sorry. Okay, so the objectives is Russ, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over them again since Russ very well delineated them. And the question comes up as to why this is important. So the next slide looks at the fact that when you do a survey and you take a look, this is from the Kaiser Foundation, and you take a look at what people want at the end of life. Well, they want to die at home, basically. But then they want to do that because they don't want to receive things that they never would have wanted to have done to them or their family members. And many of the treatments and interventions don't necessarily align with who they are and their values. So despite the fact of their stated preference to spend their last days at home, only, about, it's still the great majority of them die in hospitals. And then in addition to the disparities that already have been documented in hospice and palliative care utilization, they're associated with race and ethnicity. People who have low levels of health literacy are more likely to seek or at least agree to the most intensive curative treatments at the end of life, as opposed to choosing those that would bring most comfort to them at the end of life. And there's a variety of different reasons why that happens. So next slide, please. This is from a study that was done, actually, even the first version of it that was done in 2 Boston hospitals was done as part of the support study, which is the acronym for Study to Understand Prognosis and Preferences for Outcomes and Risks of Treatments. And it came along at the same time that Congress had passed the Patient Self-Determination Act, requiring people to inform patients about their rights for them to execute an advance directive. And the research indicated at the time that there was a preference for an advance directive that can be open and influenced by a variety of different things: a person's attitudes, their belief system, their health condition, and of course their trust with the healthcare system and the healthcare professionals. And the findings were all very interesting in the sense that people that were less likely to have any advance directive were likely to experience a variety of things that they themselves did not care for it to be used in their treatment at the end of life. And it was clear that Black care, people that were Black and were care recipients were less likely than white recipients to have any attention paid to their advance directive, even if it was in their charts. So with that in mind, there was actually even a clinical trial that was done, part 1 and part 2, looking at physicians' preferences to how to best deal with this. And the outcome was that when it was offered to them that one of the possible things to improve compliance with this was to create a liaison team to discuss end-of-life issues and to make an informed consent about what determination they would want to occur, what kind of treatments they would want to occur at the end of life, that would be the way to go. So somebody else would come in, a team of individuals that would talk to the family and the patient, and that would be communicated to the team. And then, of course, those orders would be written. And what was the outcome? Was that the creation of the team and the creation of the discussion and the creation of the feedback did not alter any of the outcomes, and people were still experiencing that they were in fact being given treatments that they would have preferred not to have had. So next slide. With that in mind, that was at the time that the model of care was, as you see at the very top, was largely focused on reversibility and curative factors with a very limited amount of time on palliative care. Over time, that has become more balanced, with curative factors being about 50% of the time and palliative care being about 50% of the population at the end of life or nearing the end of life. And that now there has been an even greater focus on part of the palliative to be balanced with psychosocial and the spiritual. Now, you might all be saying, well, of course, that's exactly what a psychiatrist would say and would see as important at the end of life. But the next slide shows you part of the reason why. I hope you can all read the handwriting here. This was a note that was found from a patient that was attached to legal paperwork. And what you see is that the person writes in this very nice little pad that even has the caption that says, "Those who plant courtesy harvest friendship," writes this horrific message to the family. This gives you, she was executing her wishes and her will and her end of life and advanced directives and end of life care. And she says, "This gives you the right to do anything but shoot me. I suppose there were times when you wish you could. So love, Mom." So if you find these, I'm sure that all of you have an anecdote about irreconcilable differences between families, not necessarily related to the end of life. but things that were, but grudges and all sorts of things that were carried on for years. And of course, they all come to a head at this time, which is part of the reason that this work is important. Next slide. Since the 80s and the 90s, well, there's been a large number of Americans that have left largely Christianity to join a large group of US adults that describe their religious identity as either atheist and agnostic or nothing in particular, or SBNR, or spiritual but not religious. And this has been an accelerating trend that's reshaping the US religious landscape, leading many people to wonder what the future of religion and faith and spirituality might look like in the future. But aside from that, since that's not the focus of this talk, there's another the larger group that's actually been growing over the past 10 years is the one that has to do with this message that I received while I was watching the Astros play the Rangers. Next slide. And spirituality messages are coming across all media these days. But I was quite surprised watching the Astros game with the Rangers in Arlington to see this little bracketed area on the pitcher's mound. He gets us. And I didn't know what that was. And so I Googled it, and it turns out that this is $1 million campaign with all sorts of online ads and billboards to target millennials with a message about Jesus, that Jesus gets us. But if you look at their messaging, it has to do with aligning Jesus's experiences with that of millennials and Generation Z, that their struggle is the same struggle, and that their interests might resonate with each other. And that in finding Jesus, you find solutions to the kinds of earthly problems that you might experience. So I don't know how many of you have seen this, but there's the link for you to be able to get some more information about this group. Next slide. One of the other important things is that talking about death now is a billable service. So it's under the advanced care planning initiatives that occur, and you could, and it's a billable service, and you see that, and I've given you the references not only about the billing process, but also what goes behind this in terms of the Code of Ethics, the section relevant to this from the Code of Ethics of the AMA, and then what recent studies have shown that that billing for advanced care planning is, while growing, when you do a survey, you find that the majority of the physicians who are likelier to be involved in this kind of conversation still don't use the codes. So what the barriers are for that to occur in terms of initiating the talks and completing the talks and documenting the talks is up for grabs. I think people are looking at all possible permutations of this to see why is there a barrier with this as well, especially since it was facilitated being able to incorporate it into your service and remuneration for your service. But then the one that really gets me and is I was sitting in an office not too far from where I am now at the medical school here in Harlingen. And the next slide, please. I get this message that says end of life for Windows 7, and that I could actually get an upgrade. Now, I don't know if this is billable or not for the university, but I found it odd in terms of the language that was being used, and the fact that I could be upgraded to a better level of quality of Windows. So Windows 11 is nothing to write home about. The next slide. So let's begin with objective 1, which is to review the continuum of relevant experiences leading up to the conceptual framework of spirituality. And I was telling the IHA team earlier, next slide, that part of my initial interest in this area has to do with the conceptual framework of grief. And then certainly everybody knows that this occurs in someone, it's an experience that one has with a response to a loss, while usually it has to be the loss of someone else that is tied to which a bond or affection was formed. But it could be anything in terms of the variety of environmental things that occur. So it can be related to a loss, even in some situations where there can be some good news, but you're basically missing the previous stage in your development that you no longer will be a part of by engaging in this new phase of life. But it gives you an idea of how deep, to give you an idea of how deep this is. I used to run a grief group for families that had lost their children to sudden infant death syndrome. And in that group, actually, I had allowed other people that were in the grieving process to join as well. And so there was an older man who was part of the group. And the latest couple that was admitted into the group was a couple that had lost their child to SIDS. And it was a 3-hour group. So we'd have a break, coffee break at the hour and a half at the midpoint. And I saw that the young man that was part of the couple that had just been admitted to the group gravitated to the older man in the coffee area and was speaking with him. So I was naturally curious about what the process was. And so I came in at the piece in the conversation where the young man says to him, you know, how long have you been coming to this group? And the man said, well, I was here even before Dr. Fernandez took over the group. So I've been here roughly for about 10 years. And the young man was sort of floored by that and said, 10 years? Is that how long your grief has been? And of course, the older man sort of explained the situation. And then he said, well, how long does this process last? And the old man thought about it, took a sip of his coffee and said, I don't know technically how long this process lasts, but I was married to my wife for 47 years and I figured that it'll take 47 years to get over it. Now, obviously that was his way of expressing the deep bond that occurred between him and his wife and how painful and how much suffering he had day in and day out with her loss. The next slide, please, is a definition of religion. And it's the belief in and worship of a superordinate or superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. And the term actually comes from the Latin religare, which means literally to tie, bind, fasten. And the sociocultural definition, of course, is to tie both ends, the living and the dead. And it's viewed as a cultural system that's designated behaviors and practices. In the interest of time, we won't go into this, but it leads to the next slide, which is spirituality. And it may refer to almost any kind of meaningful activity. In some instances, people believe that it's a search for something that is sacred, but it may also refer to one's own personal development and growth as a person, or an experience that can be blissful or mystical, or an encounter with one's self in the deepest sense, in the inner dimension of one's psyche. And while not everybody would describe themselves as spiritual, there's an instinctual drive towards something spiritual that's deeply ingrained in human beings. And I'll digress for just a second. If some of you are familiar with the work of a neurosurgeon and psychologist in Montreal years back when epilepsy surgery was beginning, they decided that they would, since they were being asked to basically remove epileptic foci from the brain tissue, they decided to map the brain. And it was interesting that in many patients in the non-dominant hemisphere, in a particular area of the brain, when they stimulated in that area, the individual had an overwhelming mystical experience, spiritual experience, where their faith just basically took over for them. It wasn't necessarily a particularly religious experience, but it was just a side that they had never experienced before within themselves that was stimulated by this. So it is an instinctual drive in a way, since it appears that we may be wired for it. Next slide. If you want to read more about this in terms of grief and spirituality and the end-of-life care. There is this is from a book from the Hospice Foundation of America. Now the chapters of the book and the book itself in different forms is available on Vimeo, and you could see the link there, but there are other resources as well. The Palliative Care Network of Wisconsin has done tremendous work. They have created actually a psychosocial curriculum and a spiritual review system that can be used at the end of life for the purposes of establishing a connectivity with the patient and advanced care planning. Next slide, please. So what about this spirituality in America? Clearly in the decade of the brain, it has also been in the 90s, has also been the decade of spiritual but not religious. And the latest PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute survey, highlights that a significant number of people describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. And then you see the breakdown of the categories in this slide. The next slide, if you want to read more about this and about a person's own transition in this process, those of you that are familiar with Sam Harris's work know that at one time he denounced all religious beliefs, and then later he wrote a book called Waking Up, which I think has a nice definition here. Defines spirituality as that which begins an experience with the reverence for the ordinary that can lead us to insights and experiences that are anything but ordinary. But how does this translate to end-of-life care and palliative care? Next slide. And does this influence end-of-life decision? And for that, we can turn to requests for euthanasia. But more importantly, I think it leads us into the transition now to defining barriers and solutions, which is objective 2 for us today. So the next slide shows a study that was done a while back, but repeated studies have really not changed the findings very much. The reasons in the Netherlands for requesting euthanasia. And you'll see that there are several factors here. And it's clear that suffering that causes requests for euthanasia and assisted suicide is primarily a psychological, a psychosocial, and a spiritual one. And if you look at pain, the reason that it comes out as number 2 here, or number 3, along with unworthy dying, is because of what I call the D4. And you see down below the asterisk marked section of the slide in the table, you'll see that stands for despair, disillusionment, demoralization, and illness-induced despondency. And those are the critical items, because really when you look at pain as the only symptom, that only accounts for about 5 to 10% of the individuals that are experiencing sufficient pain to request euthanasia. In the next slide, I'm always reminded of, you see here Dr. Richard Carmano, it was the US Surgeon General under Bush. And you see that he has this beautiful quote that really has been adopted. Well, the Surgeon General had adopted health literacy as one of his primary interests, but it's really one of the driving issues in terms of making sure that healthcare professionals are well immersed in this information. Because in general, they do not seem to be able to recognize and identify that patients do not understand the health information that they're trying to communicate. Even now in the medical school here, we try to get the students to say, okay, repeat things after I just did to see if you get what I just told you the treatment plan is and what your condition is. But we have to close the gap between what healthcare professionals know and what the rest of everyone else understands, including the family. So this leads us to look at next slide. What are the major influences at the end of life and what helps form decisions? And in the interest of time, I'm going to just list these for you and begin with the last bullet, which is a discussion of physicians' health with the physicians of and the healthcare team of their situation. Because that'll focus on palliative care, as you know, which it might be regarding things like pain management and nausea and a variety of other discomforts that the individual might feel. But obviously, family discussions, which are also can be a source of discomfort, falls under the same rubric as well. My global well-being and what the quality of my life is, my personal experiences and reflections that I may have had, and what my religious and spiritual beliefs might be if the issue of faith comes into the discussion. And then the issue that has to do with many individuals' concerns, which is burdening their family, particularly with financial burden. Next slide, please. And what you see here is that the major what you see here is the experiential states that are part of the process that one would like to go through. Taking the work that was done by Jim Griffith, for example, and his wife, looking at points of vulnerabilities in the experience that individuals have at the end of life. And these might be points of isolation, despair, helplessness, anonymity, and meaninglessness and sorrow. And Jim and Melissa do a fantastic job at giving you the narrative. They take you word by word, basically, of how these were addressed and how people turn points of vulnerability into points of resilience by focusing then on the therapeutic aspects of moving isolation in a more comforting area of communion with others, transitioning despair into hope, which is critical in this part of the discussion about finding meaning, of helplessness to assertiveness, taking somebody from meaninglessness to giving them a sense of purpose, and then taking them from a state of sorrow to actually experience joy in their life as they live onto death. Next slide, please. So this takes us now into the more practical strategies of palliation and the role in which psychiatry plays in this regard, looking specifically at psychosocial and environmental problems. Next slide. And this takes us to objective 3 and looking at an evidence-based medical model for best practices. And that includes, next slide, the search for meaning, which is essentially a psychotherapeutic process. This is not a theological experience. This is not a philosophical experience. This is really, truly developing a remembrance of life. And it's a remembrance of a previous existence where one had both good and bad happening to them in their life, and composing from that what is significant and what is most important to helping them live in this condition until the end of life or death for them. Next slide. So the areas of psychosocial distress or stress and distress are areas that we looked at before in terms of major influences now become the same areas, become barriers. And the resolution of this stress and distress by looking at the barriers and doing the same thing that Jim and Melissa did with respect to points of vulnerabilities and to points of resilience is key for going through each and all of them. And again, in the interest of time, I won't go through each one, but let's go to the next slide and look at the process. The process is really a search for meaning as part of the looking at the personal relationships that the individual has, not only with other people in their environment and in their family and in their support system, but do they have a personal relationship with a higher power or God? And then the third one is the capacity for self-care. And one of the issues that have been people have been struggling most is to look at this concept of self-compassion. Are individuals, as part of taking care of themselves as they near death, are they able to be compassionate with themselves and forgive themselves in some way for things that may have happened in their life that may have interfered full fulfillment on the basis of whatever the conditions were at the time? And I think it's important that you take, the process has been very well delineated, by the way, by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist, who himself was a Holocaust survivor that wrote in Man's Search for Meaning. And there's his quote. His quote is basically, when we are no longer, sorry, there was a pop-up that came on the screen, on my screen. When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And this is the thrust of the psychotherapeutic work that must be completed at the end of life. Next slide, please. Now, the fourth element is, what about angry? Do you ever get angry? Do you get angry at your doctors? Do you get angry at God? And do you get angry at your family? And then the questions that are opening questions that get around to this issue of anger is, have you ever sensed that you look at the existence of some other, or experience a relationship with a higher power, whether that's God for you or not? And are families and friends important to you in your life, and in what way? And I usually refer patients to look at this book called Yossel Brackover Talks to God. And it's an interesting book about a man, a Jewish man from Poland who is in Warsaw, expecting the Nazis to come in. And he's by himself in his apartment. And he initiates a discussion with God, largely out of his anger, about how God could let something like this happen. And the only reason to use it is because it allows people to open up the discussion of anger in a way that isn't totally focused on them, but it's really parallel to their experience. So it raises the issue for them and discusses with them how the illness or the condition may affect them, and how their faith affects them, and whether they have any anger in them, and is the anger, how the anger might need to get resolved. The next slide, please. And some of the solutions are around what Viktor Frankl would talk about in terms of maintenance of hope at the end of life. Next slide. And how does one do this? And one does this essentially looking at the philosophy of the person and defining them as individuals at the end of life. So you basically have to do a review, and that's where the word anamnesis comes in, because it's a remembrance. It's a remembrance of all that has been part of their life, no matter whether it was good or bad or indifferent. And you, out of that, call out what their accomplishments have been, what their passions as well as their aversions have been. If there's anything that they feel that they would like to improve or achieve before death, and what, if any, conflicts need to be resolved, and the timeline for that. So you do this review, and you can see on the right-hand side follow-up questions that allow you to gain more depth. This is by no means an exhaustive list of questions to sort of keep in mind thematically for when you're talking to people at the end of life. But you want to be able to utilize them in developing their narrative with their words. Next slide, please. Sorry, the person's office that I'm using, their printer is going on. And then you want to define the person at the end of life. Is there anything that they're especially proud of? Have they been through rough times like this before? And what has helped them? What has helped them? And then, of course, the last question being anything that would be worth dying for in your life. And what would that be? And how would that bring you dignity? And how would that be meaningful to you? Next slide. So at the very end of this sort of discussion, as you're sorting things out, you have to look at what the nature of the relationship with a higher power or a God might be. And you might want to know what sort of entity or what sort of being is God, and what qualities do they have, and what is the communication between them and God, which is very much like what you read about in the narrative of Yossel Brackover Talks to God. And then the last two questions, which is, once the person says, oh, it's a one-way or a two-way conversation, did they get any answers to the questions? And if so, how do they know that those are the answers from that entity or that being or that God? And it really comes down to the core of their being at that point in time. And it's an incredibly powerful discussion to have with individuals. Next slide, please. The issue of death and how different groups view end-of-life issues and can be highlighted or is highlighted in this particularly thorough review by the individuals that are from a variety of different places, both in the United States, but also Canada. And you can look it up and look at very carefully at each of the views and what they espouse, that if an individual identifies himself from one group or another with a particular religion, first of all, do they adhere to these views that the group has? And if not, what are their views if different from that of the group? And so you need to be, if they identify themselves as a particular denomination or a particular religion, you need to look at this very carefully as part of being able to engage in that discussion with them. And of course, you need to present a variety of balanced perspectives, in a way challenging them, but in a way also helping them consolidate or solidify their views. Next slide, please. So what are the tasks for the patients? What are the tasks for the family and loved ones? And then of course, in the next slide, you'll see the tasks for the caregivers or the physicians or the healthcare team. So for the patient, generally the more positive things that bring about that brings about the resolution is to focus on what is the benefit of their death to others. Particularly significant individuals will be survivors. And you can come up with all sorts of things that people eventually get to, that survivors benefit from their love or benefited from their being a faithful and honest, father or mother or spouse or partner. And because I always supported them in what they wanted to be and reinforced their good qualities for them. And because whenever they were in distress or whenever they were in difficulties, they would always be supportive and sustain them in the more difficult times or challenging times in their lives. For the families is basically a similar sort of process, but theirs is more focused around bringing them around to addressing what the unfinished business is between them and the individual that's facing death, and how you could help them to have a good death, which is how people refer to it, but it's something that that can bring them comfort, that they can be proud. And so you always, especially with people that are extremely difficult and can't really talk very well about their emotions or what they would like to say, is to address it by saying, after the individual has died, you might ask yourself, well, if only I had said this, or if only I had said that. So you need to bring it around to sort of, it's not a worse outcome for them, but certainly not a worser outcome for you as a survivor. And that should be the two major tasks, to bring them together at the end. And then the third one, next slide, which is examining the clinician's role. In this book from Dame Cicely Saunders from the UK, who founded the hospice movement, is living with dying, which is an interesting sort of way to title it, right? So how do I understand this process? Please make sure that you listen to them and that you don't disappear. If you say, especially if you happen to be, somebody in behavioral health, that you're going to be there, you have to be there, okay? And you have to be there and just listen. If that's all that you can do, because you can't tolerate much more than that in terms of the suffering that the individual is going through. Focus on their uniqueness, their individual worth, and bring it back to that, but you have to listen to them. And how do you impart empathic insights? And the two basic elements of empathy is a commitment to them of non-abandonment and a commitment to respect them in a sense of reverence for them as a unique human being. And those are the basic tasks, of course, that as you're dealing with this, you may need to focus on. Of course, the book Living with Dying goes over much more depth than I could in this period of time. Next slide. This brings us to the issue of what do you do with the concept of somebody who's hopelessly and irreversibly ill, that they're in a state of suffering and limited a prospect for recovery of limited function or a full recovery. So I'll tell you what my mother wanted me to do. My mother had seen my father die in a hospital on full support. And she had noticed, she was very observant about the different things that he was going through. And at one point, she had to give permission for my father to get a feeding tube put in, a J tube. And one of the things that she conveyed to me, she said afterwards, when she was discussing her own needs and why she wanted me of all the other siblings, since I was the youngest, to be her surrogate, was not because she held psychiatry in great esteem in terms of medicine, but it was because she wanted to make sure that, because I understood what my father went through and what she was going through, that the same thing would not happen to her. And one of the things that she kept coming to was I should have never allowed them to put the J tube in, because she said it didn't change anything. And of course, all the other procedures that they did, which didn't change anything, didn't change his prognosis, and certainly didn't relieve any of his suffering. So with the hopelessly and irreversibly ill, you want to look at these issues and look at the loss of sense of purpose for the individual and delineate that. Delineate the boundaries of that as you address their needs at this critical point in time. Next slide, please. I always think of this quote by Martin Buber with respect to irreversibility and the sense of maintaining hope in somebody who is irreversibly and hopelessly ill. And when a man is singing and cannot lift his voice, and another comes and sings with him, another who can lift his voice, then the first will be able to lift his voice too. And that is the secret of the bond, spirit and spirit. And next slide, please. One of the things that for me that has that clarified, and even now I have this baseball group of people at the end of life who happen to be deaf. And they like to watch baseball, but they can't talk about it with anybody because they can't hear the television and so on. And even the caption, they miss a lot of what the people that are talking about it say. So we text each other during baseball games, which is fine with me. I'm Cuban and I love baseball, so it's no extra time on my part since I'd be doing it anyway. But people ask all the time when they think about the hopelessly and irreversibly ill, is this not false hope that you're talking about? And I always like to use the quote by Václav Havel, who was not only the last president of Czechoslovakia, but the first president of the Czech Republic after it freed itself. And that is, hope is not the same thing as optimism. It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out. And I think that kind of really clarifies a lot of this issue about how do you give meaning and hope at the end of life. And that is, it'll make sense. So a reasoned action approach is important, regardless of how it turns out, and it'll be good. Next slide, please. So the risk for low literacy at end of life, and I'm sorry that we're almost at the end here. Objective number 4, Russ, I think, put together it well at the very beginning, so I'll refer you back to his slides. But I'll close with this particular point that I want to make, and that is that no matter which study you look at, health literacy is an independent predictor of health of end-of-life preferences. And I think it's important that we remember Carmana's quote and try to explain ourselves in a better way and make sure that people understand what we're doing and their care as part of their death. Next slide, please. Oh, by the way, that's an excellent online reference for people who are users. So families and so on can go on and they can get information there. Next slide, please. I always like to use this. I don't know how many of you have had experience with end-stage renal disease and individuals in a dialysis setting, but I always like to use the information from their studies. People are most familiar with other conditions, including cancer, but I always think that that here's where you really get the feel for how important health literacy is. That limited health literacy really presents a substantial barrier to communication at end of life. 13%, only 13% of patients in a high mortality situation in a dialysis center had discussed end of life preferences with their physicians. And while a larger number had discussed it with their family and support network, a quarter of them stated that they had never considered end-of-life preferences in terms of issues dealing with dialysis at the end of life. And their limited understanding of this meant that they committed themselves to care that they would not otherwise have done, more so than others. Okay. And so I really think this is the one group that I think stands out in my mind about these critical issues about finding meaning. And the only way you're going to get to find better meaning is in making better choices from the very beginning when you're confronted with something like this. Again, to follow my mother's sort of concern, my father was also put on dialysis. And again, she points to the fact that it didn't make a difference in terms of his comfort and in terms of reversibility. So please make sure that you address these issues. I'm going to close with a patient. I actually wore my Beatles tie today. I don't know if you could see my Beatles tie. This is, do you want to know a secret? Because it always, when I give this talk, I like to think of him since he was one of my most difficult individuals. And to use the typical task that a lot of these things have to do with, I see people saying that they enjoyed my tie. My wife tried to talk me out of it because it doesn't look good with the shirt I'm wearing, apparently. But in any case, the tasks at hand are usually wrapped around these four things. So forgive me. So he was a particularly tough individual. He loved rock and roll music. And he loved, and we always got into arguments about Let It Be and Abbey Road, which one was actually the last album, and where could you find greatest meaning of all things, right? So I brought him a tape of Abbey Road, and he had heard it 50,000 times before, okay? And so it really caught him by surprise, since he really didn't want to engage with me in any way when he heard the song at the very end. And so really this process can take many different directions, and you can go in many different directions. This one's happened to be with music, but it could be with anything that brings you around to finding closure and finding meaning for the person. But the tasks here at hand, which are commonplace, and you could look at these as reference to every curriculum for psychosocial or for palliative care, is to go through this process, to forgive, for the individual to seek forgiveness, for the individual to forget others, forgive, not forget, sorry, what a slip, a Freudian slip of sorts at this time, and to thank them for, generically being the best thing that ever happened to them. And to say, I love you. And so I don't know how many of you have heard this song. A lot of people say they don't understand how he found meaning in this song. But in any case, just to show you that anything could happen and anything could bring about an opening to always maintain and sustain a sense of hope. So my last slide. It's the toughest thing to do at the end of life, to go through those 4 things. Try to say them every day. Try going home tonight and begin to say them to your spouse or family. And it reminds me, for me to say to you, to forgive me for all the difficulties that you've encountered today with the presentation and my having to be out of sorts with my personal situation, but at the same time, going off track and digressing because of my cultural background being Cuban. We tend to digress. I forgive you for anything that you may have thought of my tie or anything else that you may have felt was irreverent about this presentation. And I want you all to know how much I've loved the opportunity that IHA has given me and of Russell to work with him and to get a chance to meet you from afar by doing this today.
And actually, Frank,
and that's a
thank
picture
you.
of my family, by the way, when I was in a moment of difficulty myself and happened to be at the Cleveland Clinic. And of course, what did they do? They know that I'm a Rolling Stones freak. So they went to the Cleveland Clinic. They went to the Cleveland Clinic, to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, and made a poster of this picture. Of course, they're all crouching, so I could see everything that was behind them. And we made we framed this into a poster so that I could have it in my room at all times. And think of them and say, I love them. So thank you so much again. I'm sorry that I only have given you a minute left, but like I said, I'm willing to answer questions by email. So please make sure that you send them along.
Thank you, Frank. We've gotten some wonderful comments, suggestions, additions in the chat box, which I think everybody's been able to see, but I will, Scarlett, if you could copy those for Dr. Frank to see, that would be great. And remember, everyone, that October coming up in a couple of days is Health Literacy Month. During Health Literacy Month, we promote the importance of understandable health information. And thank you, Dr. Frank, for really promoting the importance of understandable health information in the end of life period. Both Dr. Fernandez and I are committed to the importance of easy to understand information about health. And we ask you to please join us in advocating for health literacy awareness among patients, clinicians, and organizations. IHA has a very nice website at healthliteracymonth.org, which has some videos and some information. And I'm sure we might be able to put a link to this talk on that as well. So Scarlett or Julie, let me turn it over to you for this final slide.
Yes, thank you so much, Russ, and thank you so much, Dr. Fernandez. That was really thought-provoking, and just I was copying everything, but I just want to let everyone know, because you're probably all in the same boat, the slides and the recording will be on the website on the webinar page pretty soon. So know that that's there and that you can revisit all of this stuff. There was so much to think about here. And I just want to let you know that, yeah, I think that's it. And then just if you need CE credits, just submit the evaluation when it comes to you, and we will get you. There was a couple questions, but we will we'll send people the answers in a few days. I just want to thank you guys so much for this excellent presentation.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure, and hope to see you again soon.